Hi everyone. So in this video what we're going to discuss is how branching scores work as they relate to games. Now branching is an interactive scoring technique that many games use, and the thing that makes it a little different is that generally we wait for a musical demarcation point, like the end of a phrase, before deciding to go on to another phrase or repeat the same phrase and things like that. And when preparing these phrases, when splitting up these phrases for the game or another engine, one of the things that you want to keep in mind is how the reverb tail works. And so if I go from one phrase to another, the phrase preceding should have a reverb tail that corresponds to that overlaps into the next phrase. So we're going to explore that, and what I've done is I have an excerpt from the beginning of Holst Mars here, and I'm using Reason, although you can really follow along and do this in any DAW. I have an outrageous amount of reverb on this track so that we can really hear the reverb tails once we start splitting it up and start overlapping phrases and things like that. So the first thing that I wanted, and there are a few issues that you might encounter with splitting up your phrases, and so we're going to go through those, including things like playing a little ahead of the beat, which we're going to see actually when I export this first loop. So for instance, if you play a little ahead of the beat and you split it, and you might hear that note in the previous phrase, and so sometimes you have to quantize and get the notes in the correct phrases. So let's listen to the first 2 bars of this. All right, so that I'm going to take that first ostinato phrase and I'm going to export it, and so I'm going to take that and export it out of here, and I'll call this phrase 1, and I'll export it as a WAV file. And then I'm actually going to create a brand new Reason session here, and I'm going to add a couple audio tracks, and this is basically just for testing so we can hear how this would sound in a game engine or game middleware solution. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up my desktop where I put my first phrase, and let's just take a listen. Now this doesn't have the reverb tail, it just has the phrase itself, but I want to make sure that it's correct. And by the way, I'm actually going to change my tempo to the right tempo, which in this case is 144. That's what my Holst track is, and also the meter is 5/4. So now when I import this, it will look a little bit better here in that it's 2 bars. So let's just listen to it on its own. All right, so a few things that you might have noticed. First, we hear that outrageous reverb that I have, and second, we have the beginning of the brass note for the next section. So for instance, when we take this and copy it and move it over here, when it loops, we hear a little blip of the brass that comes in there, and we also hear the reverb kind of stop at the first beat, and that's a little bit harder to hear because there are like plenty, it's double forte and really loud. But essentially when you get to the beginning of that loop, there's no reverb tail that should be continuing, say, from beat 4. So for instance, as beat 4 is sort of, or beat 5 is sort of happening here, that reverb would then sort of travel into that next bar. And the way that's set up here, we've just taken this loop, and at the very beginning of the loop, way back on bar 1, beat 1, there isn't reverb tail coming before it. So reverb is similar to echo that you might hear in Symphony Hall, or when an orchestra stops, the echo sort of goes around Symphony Hall and echoes out. And that's what a reverb tail is, but on the very first note, there's generally not reverb. So when we export this, we're not hearing reverb at the beginning. So let's go back and kind of fix those things in my original cut down here. And so the first thing that I want to do is maybe take the brass pieces. So what I'm going to do is select all those and kind of zoom in a little bit here. And you can see it's a little before beat 3, at least these first, this one and this one. So maybe what I'll do is open up the tools window. The tools window allows me to quickly quantize things. So what I'll do is set it maybe to quarter notes and apply quantization. Now when I export that section, it should be clean. So let's do that really quickly. I'll export that, and I'm going to deal with the reverb tail in just a minute. So I'll call this phrase 1 quantized. And then I'm going to go to my other session here and drag in from my desktop here phrase 1 quantized, and that should have gotten rid of the little brass blip that I had at the end of that, and I forgot to turn the snapping to bars back on, so I did that quickly. So now at least I'll have a clean loop to listen to without the little horn anticipation before bar 3 enters. Now it may be a little bit more obvious the beginning of bar 3 where the reverb will drop out for a second. Now, depending on your piece of music, that may be more obvious. If you have delays, delays would be even more apparent there if they sort of and basically any echoes or any reverbs are going to kind of go past bar 3 there. And so we want to pick those up in the engine. And Wise and my Unity template both support reverb tails, so you can overlap these regions so that you get the right thing at the right time. So let's go ahead and kind of go back to our original piece and start splitting things up. Now what I like to do is put 1 or 2 bars of silence after I've done the composition in between phrases. So I'm done composing. What I'm going to do is insert 2 bars of silence between my first phrase and the second phrase. So what I'll do is take out the razor blade tool, and I'll go down here and basically cut each one of these like this. And then I'll be able to kind of move them. And so now I can go back to the selection tool, kind of pick these up like this. And what I'm going to do is kind of select the rest of my sequence here. Oops, I missed that green one down below. Close my tools window, and actually I'll do this. So I'll select from bar 3 to the end, and remember this is just an excerpt, and I'm going to move all that stuff 2 bars later so that when I hear this, when I play the first phrase back, right, that whole reverb, that outrageous reverb continues beyond it. And the brass section, sort of the next phrase, and then right at bar 9, so that's the end of my second phrase at bar 9, now that I inserted 2 bars. And so what I can do here, again, is sort of use my razor blade tool and kind of select to the end here, and then use my select tool and then put 2 bars after this. And now I export, and we'll experiment with this. So I'll take the first 4 bars here, so 2 bars of the actual ostinato, 2 bars of reverb tail, and I'll export that as a loop and call this phrase 1 quantized with verb for reverb, and export that. And then I'm going to take the horn phrase after that and take it from bar 5 here up through bar 10 and go ahead and export that. And I'll just call this phrase 2. Okay, now I'll go back to my test bank here, and remember this is the one without the reverb tail. I'll go to my Finder, I'll pull in my quantized phrase with the reverb tail, And then I'll also pull in phrase 2. And then sort of arrange this. And what I'll do is, because the game is going to sort of choose when I move from one phrase to another, what I'll do is kind of play phrase 1 twice, and maybe 3 times. And so that's where the first one would begin, and the next one is going to begin a little bit later. So, and notice how they're now overlapping. So 2 voices are going to play at the same time, but we'll get this nice clean reverb tail. And then we'll play our new phrase. This is the horn phrase where this one ends. So if I stack them, I'm going to add another audio track here. And so I'm stacking them kind of like this. And so now we'll get these nice clean reverb tails into each section. In fact, we're going to do one more. We're going to take this other, create one more audio track here to kind of just show you that I can pick up this and move it here. And then the reverb tail of the brass section here is going to overlap with that original ostinato section. So let's listen to it all together. Phrase 1, reverb tail coming up, overlapping into phrase 2. So nice clean phrases overlapping. And we're going to hear the overlap again. Now, Holst Mars doesn't sound like this because we don't go back into that ostinato again. It basically, so we're kind of rearranging the piece dynamically within whatever game engine that we're in. So when you export your files, depending on the middleware engine that you're using, either Wise or my branching template, you can insert, you can leave these reverb tails so that you can overlap phrases. In Wise, you actually set up a marker where the reverb tail begins, but in the Unity engine, the Unity branching template, you actually have to measure where your reverb tail begins to the end. So you basically would go in here and say, all right, the first one's at 4 seconds, .167, and that reverb tail ends at 8:33:33. So I'd subtract from 833, I'd subtract this number, and that would give me the length of the reverb tail, and you'd be able to insert it into the branching template. Hope this helps. This is a great way to kind of understand how reverb tails overlap between phrases or even loops of different material, and it's definitely applicable to working with Fmod and Wise as well, because you can set up those nice seamless reverb tails between phrases. Let me know if you have any questions.